Have you noticed how life keeps getting more expensive, even though we're told the system is working? That's not an accident, it's a signal. Behind the scenes, a global economic strategy designed to punish one country is bending the entire world out of shape. And once you understand why the numbers don't match the narrative, you'll realize why 2026 could hit households harder than anyone expects. Have you noticed something strange lately? You do everything right. You work harder, you budget smarter, you cut back where you can, and yet somehow, life keeps getting more expensive. Rent climbs, groceries sting, energy bills bite harder every quarter, and we're told this is temporary. That inflation is cooling, that the system is stabilizing. But here's the uncomfortable truth most people never hear. When reality doesn't match the narrative, it's usually because something deeper is breaking underneath. This video isn't about a single country, it's not about politics. And it's definitely not about picking sides. It's about a global economic experiment, one designed in boardrooms, central banks, and foreign ministries, that was supposed to reshape the world in a very specific way. It had a clear objective, clear targets, and a clear timeline. Instead, it produced the opposite result. And when that happens, the consequences don't land on politicians, they land on households, on your household. In the United States, it shows up as stubborn housing costs and a widening wealth gap between Wall Street and Main Street. In Canada and Australia, it looks like a housing trap, mortgages resetting higher while wages lag behind. In the UK, it feels like stagflation, prices up, growth flat, and pensions quietly under pressure. And even in places like Norway, long seen as insulated and stable, new risks are creeping into places people assumed were untouchable. These aren't isolated problems, they're symptoms. Symptoms of a system that didn't collapse, but bent in ways that now affect everyone. In this documentary, we're going to pull back the curtain on what actually happened when the world tried to use economics as a weapon, and why the data tells a very different story than the headlines. You'll see how global trade quietly rerouted itself, how currencies behaved in ways nobody predicted, and how a coming commodity battle could make the next cost of living shock even worse than the last one. Most importantly, you'll understand why you're paying the price, even though you had no vote in the experiment at all. Because once you see the mechanics behind this, not the opinions, not the spin, just the cause and effect, the confusion fades and clarity replaces it. For most of the last 30 years, global economics ran on a simple, almost comforting assumption. If you controlled the system, you controlled the outcome. After the Cold War ended, one financial architecture quietly became the backbone of the world. Trade moved through it. Currencies settled through it. Debt, insurance, shipping, energy, banking, all of it flowed through the same narrow channels. And whoever controlled those channels didn't need tanks or missiles. They had something far more effective: access. This is the part most people forget. Economic power wasn't about production alone. It wasn't even about growth. It was about permission. Permission to trade, permission to settle payments, permission to insure cargo, permission to borrow cheaply, permission to participate in the global economy at all. If a country played by the rules, the system rewarded them with liquidity, investment, and stability. If they didn't, the system could turn cold, fast. This wasn't theory. It worked, repeatedly. In the 1990s and early 2000s, economic pressure crushed entire economies in months. Currencies collapsed. Capital fled overnight. Inflation spiraled out of control. And when people couldn't buy food or fuel anymore, governments fell. That history created confidence. Confidence that financial weapons were cleaner than war, cheaper than war, more effective than war. Why fight when you can freeze? Why invade when you can isolate? Why negotiate when the other side's currency is unraveling in real time? Over time, this approach became automatic. Sanctions were no longer a last resort. They were the default setting. And here's where the story starts to turn. Because every system that works too well eventually teaches people how to survive without it. Quietly, gradually, out of necessity. This is the part that never makes headlines. When economic pressure is applied, adaptation doesn't happen in press conferences. It happens in shipping contracts, in payment terms, in trade routes that don't show up on maps most people look at. It happens when companies ask a simple question: what if this door closes tomorrow? At first, those adaptations look small, temporary, almost irrelevant. A different currency here, a new middleman there. A workaround that feels inefficient, but keeps things moving. But pressure doesn't fade, it compounds. And when pressure lasts years instead of months, survival turns into strategy. This is where the assumption broke. The architects of modern economic warfare were trained on a unipolar world, a world where there were no real alternatives, where if one door closed, there was nowhere else to go. But that world no longer exists. And the most dangerous thing about outdated assumptions is that they still feel correct long after reality has changed. Here's the psychological trap. When a strategy has worked for decades, failure doesn't look like failure at first. It looks like it just needs more time, more pressure, more enforcement, more commitment. So instead of asking, is this still working? The system asks, how do we push harder? That mindset is critical to understand because it explains everything that comes next. While policymakers were focused on punishment, the global economy was quietly rerouting itself. Trade didn't stop, it detoured. Money didn't disappear, it changed hands. Supply chains didn't break, they stretched and then reknit themselves in new shapes. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Economic systems don't care about narratives. They care about incentives. If there's profit in a workaround, someone will build it. If there's demand, supply will find a path. And if enough money is involved, complexity becomes a feature, not a flaw. This is where the experiment crossed a point of no return. Because once enough alternatives exist, the original weapon loses its edge. And when that happens, pressure doesn't collapse the target, it reshapes the entire system around it. That reshaping doesn't happen evenly. Some countries benefit massively. Some industries boom quietly. Some regions absorb shocks they never signed up for. And regular people, the ones watching prices climb while wages stall, become the shock absorbers. This is the foundation you need to understand before we talk about oil, before we talk about currencies, before we talk about commodities. Because the real story isn't about whether an economy collapsed or survived. It's about how a global system adapted and why the costs of that adaptation are now showing up in places they were never supposed to. And here's the key question to carry forward. What happens when economic pressure stops breaking systems and starts teaching them how to evolve? Because the next part of the story begins exactly there. Here's where the story shifts, quietly at first, then all at once. Because while the world was focused on punishment, something else was happening in parallel. A secondary economy began to form. Not underground, not illegal, just inconvenient to talk about. When pressure is applied to a system that still has demand, the system doesn't stop, it reroutes. Energy still needed to move, food still needed to be shipped, raw materials still needed buyers. And buyers, as it turns out, are remarkably pragmatic. This is the part most people never see because it doesn't come with dramatic headlines. It shows up in spreadsheets, in shipping manifests, in contracts written in currencies most Western viewers never think about. When one set of doors closed, others opened, not out of loyalty, but out of incentives. Middlemen stepped in. Shipping firms realized there was money to be made navigating gray zones. Traders realized spreads were widening, not shrinking. Insurers outside traditional Western markets spotted demand no one else wanted to touch. And where there is a spread, there is profit. This is where the setup became irreversible. Instead of trade collapsing, layers were added. Each layer took a cut. Each layer justified its existence as temporary. Each layer made the system slightly more complex and slightly harder to shut down. And complexity is protection. The longer this went on, the more infrastructure formed around it. New shipping routes, new financing arrangements, new legal frameworks written fast enough to keep pace with reality. At first, policymakers believed this was leakage, something that could be patched later. But systems don't like being rolled back. Once money starts flowing a certain way, people build careers around it. Companies invest capital around it. Governments quietly factor it into their growth forecasts. And that's when adaptation becomes structural. This is where countries that weren't even part of the original conflict stepped into starring roles. They didn't do it out of ideology. They did it because the math made sense. Buy discounted inputs, process them, resell them into markets that pretend not to notice. It's not a loophole, it's arbitrage at a geopolitical scale. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Arbitrage doesn't care about narratives. It cares about margins. While headlines talked about isolation, entire sectors were quietly expanding. Ports grew. Refineries ran hotter. Logistics firms booked record profits. This wasn't chaos. It was order, just not the kind anyone planned for. And this is the moment where the experiment stopped being about enforcement and started being about who benefits from redirection. Because redirection always creates winners. And once enough winners exist, the system defends itself. This is where the cost begins shifting outward. The extra layers don't erase value. They redistribute it. Every detour adds friction. Every intermediary adds cost. And that cost doesn't disappear. It travels. It shows up later as higher prices, as longer supply chains, as volatility that nobody can quite explain on the evening news. This is why inflation stopped behaving the way textbooks predicted, why supply shocks lingered longer than expected, why prices came down slower than policymakers promised, because the system wasn't broken, it was rearranged. And rearranged systems don't snap back neatly, they settle into new equilibria. And once those equilibria form, reversing them isn't just expensive, it's destabilizing. So instead of reversal, the world doubled down. More enforcement, more monitoring, more pressure. But here's the paradox. Every attempt to tighten control made the alternative networks more valuable. Risk premiums rose, margins widened, the incentive to innovate around the system increased. This is the moment most people miss. Economic pressure doesn't just punish the target, it trains everyone else. It teaches traders where the gaps are. It teaches shipping firms which routes pay best. It teaches entire economies how to operate without assumptions they once relied on. And once those lessons are learned, they aren't unlearned. This is why the setup matters so much, because by the time the world realized adaptation was winning over collapse, the foundation had already shifted. The experiment hadn't failed loudly. It failed silently by succeeding at creating alternatives. And that brings us to the next phase. Because once trade adapts, the next battlefield isn't ships or ports, it's currency. And what happened there surprised almost everyone. Currency warfare was supposed to be the knockout punch. After trade pressure and logistics friction came the final move, attack the money itself. Because history suggested that when currencies collapse, everything else follows. Savings evaporate, imports become unaffordable, inflation spirals. Public confidence breaks, and when confidence breaks, systems crack. That was the theory. In fact, it wasn't just theory, it had worked before, time and time again. So expectations were clear, the currency would weaken, capital would flee, banks would wobble. And pressure from inside would do what pressure from outside could not. But instead of collapse, something unexpected happened. The currency didn't disintegrate, it resisted, then it stabilized. Then, against nearly every public prediction, it strengthened. This is the moment the data stopped matching the narrative. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because once again, the explanation isn't ideological, it's mechanical. When a country is cut off from the traditional financial system, one assumption quietly breaks, that it still needs the same foreign currencies as before. Before the pressure, dollars and euros were essential. They lubricated trade, they settled energy deals, they financed imports. After the pressure, those same currencies became liabilities. Suddenly, holding them carried risk. Access could be frozen, transactions could be blocked, so behavior changed, companies reduced exposure, governments rewired settlement systems. Trade shifted into local currencies and bilateral arrangements. This wasn't some grand philosophical rebellion against the global system, it was defensive accounting. If you can't reliably use a currency, you stop demanding it, and when demand drops, prices move. This is the part most commentary misses. A currency doesn't weaken just because headlines say it should. It weakens when people don't want to hold it. And paradoxically, pressure forced exactly the opposite behavior. Foreign currency demand fell. Local currency demand rose, not out of confidence, but necessity. And necessity is powerful. Now add one more layer. Trade didn't stop. Remember, it rerouted. Energy still moved. Raw materials still sold. But now, settlement increasingly happened outside traditional Western currency rails. That meant fewer dollars and euros flowing in and fewer flowing out. This created an artificial scarcity inside the system. Scarcity supports price. At the same time, imports became more targeted, luxury goods faded, industrial inputs took priority. This matters more than it sounds. When a currency strengthens, it makes imports cheaper. Cheaper machinery, cheaper components, cheaper inputs for domestic production. In a normal export-driven economy, that would hurt competitiveness. But this wasn't a normal situation. Exports were already discounted. Buyers weren't price-sensitive. They were access-sensitive. So the usual downside of a stronger currency didn't bite the way textbooks predicted. Instead, the upside dominated. Inflation stabilized. Industrial inputs became more affordable. Supply chains localized faster. This is where the trigger flips the script. Currency pressure didn't destabilize the economy. It accelerated restructuring. And restructuring is slower than collapse, but far more durable. Here's the uncomfortable implication. Once trade, settlement, and production adapt to a new monetary reality, reversing that process is incredibly hard. You don't just switch back. Contracts are rewritten, infrastructure is built, trust networks shift, and most importantly, incentives realign. Now zoom out for a moment. This wasn't just one currency behaving strangely, it was a signal. A signal that in a fragmented world, currency power isn't absolute anymore, it's contextual. If alternatives exist, even imperfect ones, pressure leaks. And when pressure leaks, it doesn't vanish, it spreads. That spread shows up as volatility elsewhere. In bond markets, in import prices, in cost of living spikes thousands of miles away from the original target. This is why households in places completely unrelated to the original conflict started feeling strange aftershocks. Why inflation felt global, but explanations felt local. Why policy responses seemed delayed, reactive, and oddly ineffective. Because the trigger wasn't domestic mismanagement, it was systemic reconfiguration. And once currencies stop behaving the way models expect, Every assumption built on those models starts wobbling. This is the moment the experiment truly crossed into failure. Not because a currency collapsed, but because it didn't. And that forced the world into a new phase, one where financial weapons no longer guarantee predictable outcomes. Which brings us to the next scene, because once currency warfare stops delivering clean results, attention shifts again, away from money and towards something far more physical, far more finite, and far harder to substitute. This is the point where belief runs into arithmetic, because you can argue opinions all day, you can spin narratives, you can frame outcomes however you want, but numbers don't negotiate. And when the data started coming in, it told a story very different from what most people were hearing. Trade volumes didn't collapse. They shifted. Energy didn't vanish from the market. It moved through longer, more complex routes. Discounts appeared, yes, but not in the way punishment models predicted. Here's the crucial mistake most analysis makes. It stops at the first number. If a commodity sells at a discount, the assumption is simple: revenue lost. But revenue doesn't disappear, it relocates. That missing margin doesn't evaporate into thin air. It gets captured by someone. And this is where the data becomes uncomfortable. Shipping costs ballooned. Insurance premiums surged. Trading spreads widened dramatically. Each layer extracted value. But those layers weren't neutral. They were staffed, owned, financed, some by new players, some by familiar ones operating through different structures. What was supposed to be a clean denial of income became a complex redistribution machine. And redistribution is slower, but stickier. Once people get used to a new income stream, they defend it. This is why enforcement kept running into diminishing returns. Every new rule created an incentive to innovate around it. Every new restriction increased the value of flexibility. Every attempt at control raised the price of access. This is the moment the experiment quietly flipped. Instead of compressing profits, it expanded margins, just not where anyone expected. Now zoom out again. At the macro level, government revenue didn't vanish either. It fluctuated, it adjusted. Budget composition shifted, energy still mattered, but it mattered less than before. Manufacturing, agriculture, services, domestic substitution all grew out of necessity. This wasn't efficiency, it was resilience. And resilience is harder to break than dependence. Here's another number that matters more than it sounds. When energy revenue becomes a smaller percentage of total government income, pressure loses leverage. You're no longer squeezing the heart, you're squeezing a limb. Painful? Yes. Fatal? No. And every year that passes locks this shift in deeper. This is where timing matters. Sanctions and pressure work best when shock is fast and decisive. When adaptation doesn't have time to take root. But once years pass, once infrastructure is built, once alternatives normalize, the cost of reversal skyrockets. This is why the numbers started looking stubborn. Why predicted collapses kept getting delayed. Why any day now turned into eventually. And eventually is not a strategy. Now consider the secondary effects. Those extra layers, shipping, insurance, trading, didn't just take profit. They added friction. Friction means inefficiency. Inefficiency means cost. And cost doesn't stay local. It spreads outward like heat through metal, into global inflation, into supply volatility, into pricing power shifting away from consumers. This is where people in the US, Canada, Australia, the UK, and Northern Europe start feeling something that seems disconnected, but isn't. Why did construction costs spike? Why did energy prices become unpredictable even when supply looked adequate? Why did temporary inflation refuse to die? Because the global system absorbs shock by becoming more complex. And complexity is expensive. Now here's the part that really matters. None of this required conspiracy. No coordination, no grand plan. It emerged naturally from incentives. That's what makes it powerful and hard to reverse. Economic pressure didn't collapse the system. It trained it. And trained systems don't forget lessons. They remember where the exits are. They remember which currencies can be bypassed. They remember which trade routes stay open when others close. That memory lives in contracts, in logistics software, in balance sheets. And once that memory exists, future pressure loses bite. This is why the data didn't produce the victory people expected. Instead, it produced a world that's more fragmented, more expensive, and less predictable. And this is the pivot point for everything that comes next. Because once financial pressure loses reliability, attention shifts again. Away from currencies, away from trade routes, towards something that cannot be printed, cannot be digitized, and cannot be rerouted easily. Physical resources. And the most important one of the next decade isn't oil. It's copper. This is where the story stops being abstract. Because once pressure reshaped trade, currency behavior, and profit flows, the consequences didn't stay contained. They radiated outward, and they landed differently depending on where you lived. but nowhere escaped entirely. In the United States, the shock showed up quietly at first, not as a collapse, as a distortion. Asset prices stayed high even as affordability collapsed. Housing didn't fall, it froze people out. Rates climbed, but prices refused to correct the way models said they should. Main Street felt squeezed while Wall Street adapted fast. Capital flowed where complexity paid best. Energy traders, shipping firms, commodity desks, they learned how to price risk into everything. And when risk gets priced in, consumers pay for it last. That's how you get a strange mix of headlines saying inflation is easing while households still feel underwater. Now move north. Canada, a country that built decades of prosperity on stable finance and predictable trade, suddenly found itself exposed to global shifts it didn't control. Housing turned into a trap. Variable rate mortgages reset higher. Costs rose faster than wages, not because of local chaos, but because global capital became more cautious, more selective, more expensive. When money becomes less certain globally, it demands a higher return everywhere. Australia felt it too. The myth of endless property appreciation collided with reality. Households learned that when global funding costs rise, distance doesn't protect you. Imports cost more, construction costs jumped, energy volatility crept into places it hadn't been before. The system wasn't broken, but the margin for error vanished. Then there's the UK. Already dealing with structural challenges, it absorbed the shock through stagnation. Prices climbed, growth stalled. Pensions quietly took on more risk to keep returns alive. This is the invisible fallout most people miss. When global systems become unstable, long-term savings absorb pressure first, not dramatically, gradually. Now look at Europe's industrial core, Germany. Once the engine of continental manufacturing suddenly faced a brutal math problem. Energy costs rose, supply chains stretched, production became harder to justify at previous margins. Factories didn't shut down overnight. They slowed, they relocated, they postponed investment. That's what deindustrialization looks like in real life, not collapse, erosion. And erosion is harder to rally against because it doesn't feel like a crisis until it's already deep. Even countries long viewed as insulated felt the tremors. Norway, a nation with a massive sovereign wealth fund, disciplined fiscal policy, and energy reserves still faced a new kind of risk. When global energy markets become fragmented, predictability disappears. And when predictability disappears, even well-managed wealth has to be reassessed. The idea that any country is fully shielded starts to fade. Now shift east. Japan faced a different version of the shock. Currency weakness collided with rising import costs. Energy became more expensive. The demographic burden grew heavier. Years of ultra-loose policy collided with a world that suddenly demanded yield again. China experienced something even more complex. Internal deflation on one side, commodity inflation pressure on the other. Ghost cities met record demand for raw materials. This is what happens when a country becomes both the world's factory and its shock absorber. And India? India saw opportunity, but also pressure. Discounted energy fed growth, refining and trade boomed. But rising global commodity prices began squeezing consumers across the global south. This is the part rarely acknowledged. When large powers reroute trade, smaller economies don't get choice. They get price. This is why inflation felt synchronized globally, even when domestic conditions differed. It wasn't one country overheating. It was one system rebalancing unevenly. And here's the key insight. None of this required a global recession. None of it required collapse. It only required friction, more steps, more intermediaries, more uncertainty. And every extra layer acted like sand in the gears. Slowing growth, raising costs, reducing tolerance for mistakes. This is the fallout phase, where the experiment's failure doesn't show up as disaster, but as a persistent drag on living standards. And once that drag sets in, politics gets louder, policy gets messier, and long-term planning gets harder. Which brings us to the next question. If the mechanics are this powerful, why do people keep believing simple explanations? The answer isn't economic, it's psychological. Here's the part that doesn't show up in charts or data sets, because even when the numbers started drifting off script, most people didn't question the story. Not analysts, not policymakers, not the public. And that wasn't ignorance, it was psychology. For decades, people were trained to believe that economic power worked like a switch, on or off. You either had access or you didn't. You were either inside the system or locked out. That mental model worked in a simpler world, a world with fewer players, fewer routes, fewer alternatives. So when pressure was applied, everyone expected the same movie they'd seen before. Currency collapse, capital flight, domestic unrest. But when that didn't happen, the brain reached for a comfortable explanation. It just needs more time. This is one of the most dangerous ideas in economics. Because time doesn't pause adaptation, it accelerates it. The longer pressure persists, the more people learn how to live with it. And once people learn, they don't go back. This is where confirmation bias kicked in hard. Every negative data point was amplified. Every stabilizing signal was dismissed as temporary. Every adaptation was framed as desperation, because acknowledging adaptation would mean admitting the strategy wasn't delivering the outcome it promised. And institutions hate admitting that. Not because they're malicious, but because legitimacy depends on confidence. If people believe the system is in control, they tolerate pain. If they suspect it isn't, trust erodes fast. So the narrative stayed simple. Pain now, collapse later. Accept later never arrived. And that gap between expectation and reality created cognitive dissonance. When faced with dissonance, people don't usually change beliefs. They double down. More enforcement, more pressure, more rules, which, ironically, made adaptation even more profitable. Now zoom in on the public. Most households don't track global trade flows or currency settlement mechanisms. They feel outcomes, not causes, higher prices, more volatility, less certainty. And because the causes feel distant and abstract, frustration turns inward. Why can't I get ahead? Why doesn't my paycheck stretch anymore? Why does it feel like the rules changed? Those questions rarely get clear answers. Instead, people are fed fragments, a supply chain issue here, a policy explanation there, a temporary shock that somehow lasts years. This creates anxiety, not panic. And anxiety is worse. Panic burns out fast. Anxiety lingers. It erodes confidence slowly. It changes spending behavior. It makes people cautious. And when millions of people become cautious at the same time, growth slows. This is the hidden psychological cost of a system under friction, not collapse. Hesitation. Now consider the people inside the system. Traders, executives, governments. They adapted faster because they had incentives to. When uncertainty rises, professionals don't freeze. They hedge. They diversify, they price in risk. But hedging has a cost. Diversification isn't free. Risk pricing shows up in margins, which means the system becomes more expensive by default. This is how complexity turns into inflation. Not all at once, not everywhere, but persistently. And once people internalize that higher costs are normal, expectations shift. That's the final psychological shift. Inflation stops being shocking. It becomes background noise. And background noise is dangerous because it resets standards quietly. People accept less purchasing power. They delay milestones. They downgrade expectations. This isn't a crisis moment. It's a slow grind. And slow grinds don't trigger emergency responses. They trigger resignation. This is why the experiment's failure didn't spark headlines screaming, "System broken," because nothing snapped. Instead, the system taught people to live with distortion. And once a population adapts psychologically, reversing course becomes politically harder. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about. This psychological shift doesn't stay domestic, it affects geopolitics. Countries become more inward-looking. Voters become less patient with global commitments. Governments become more transactional. Long-term cooperation becomes harder in a world where everyone feels squeezed. And that sets the stage for the next phase. Because once trust erodes, in systems, currencies, and narratives, competition intensifies, not ideologically, materially. Which brings us to the most important question of the next decade. If financial pressure no longer guarantees control, what do powers compete over instead? The answer isn't money, it's resources. And that's where this story is headed next. This is where all the threads tighten. Because once financial weapons lose precision, once trade adapts, once currencies stop behaving predictably, power doesn't disappear, it moves. And it moves toward things that can't be rerouted with contracts or clever accounting. Physical inputs, hard assets, finite resources. This is why the next phase isn't about sanctions or interest rates, it's about control of materials. And that's why 2026 matters, not symbolically, structurally. Up until now, the global system absorbs shock by stretching, longer supply chains, more intermediaries, more friction. But stretching has limits. And those limits start showing up when multiple megatrends collide at once. First collision, infrastructure demand. Across the US, Canada, Australia, and Europe, decades of underinvestment are finally colliding with reality. Power grids are aging. Housing stock is insufficient. Transportation systems need rebuilding. That alone would push demand for raw materials higher. Second collision, energy transition. Regardless of politics, the direction is set. More electrification, more data centers, more storage, more transmission. All of it requires the same thing: copper, aluminum, steel, rare inputs that can't be conjured overnight. Third collision, technological acceleration. Artificial intelligence isn't abstract, it's physical. Every AI model runs on servers. Servers sit in buildings. Buildings need power. Power needs wiring. Massive amounts of wiring. This is the part people miss. Digital revolutions are brutally material, and the build-out curve is steep. Now layer geopolitics on top. The world's largest economies have all reached the same conclusion independently. Dependence is risk. So they're stockpiling, subsidizing domestic production, paying premiums for secure supply, not because it's efficient, but because it's strategic. This is where inflation becomes sticky. When governments compete for finite inputs, price sensitivity disappears. They don't ask, is this cheap? They ask, is this secure? That's a dangerous shift for consumers, because when price stops being the primary constraint, budgets stretch, deficits widen, debt grows, currencies absorb pressure. This doesn't trigger collapse, it triggers persistent cost escalation, the kind that doesn't reverse when growth slows. Now look ahead to 2026 specifically. Why that year? Because that's when multiple investment cycles converge. Energy infrastructure spending peaks, AI build-outs scale aggressively, defense and security budgets remain elevated. Commodity supply remains constrained by long lead times. Mines don't open in a year. Smelters don't materialize overnight. Skilled labor doesn't appear on command. So demand accelerates faster than supply can respond. And when that happens, prices don't just rise, they reprice. Entire cost structures reset. Construction, manufacturing, transportation. This is where households feel it hardest. Housing doesn't just stay expensive, it becomes harder to build. Electronics don't just cost more, they fluctuate. Energy doesn't just spike, it stays volatile. And volatility is poison for planning. Now here's the key prediction. The next shock won't look like 2020, it won't look like 2008, and it won't look like 2022. It won't be sudden, it will be cumulative. People will wake up one day and realize that the baseline changed, that what used to be normal, pricing is gone. And policymakers will struggle, not because they're incompetent, but because the tools they have are blunt. You can raise rates to slow demand, but you can't rate hike your way out of a physical shortage. You can subsidize production, but you can't shortcut geology. You can message confidence, but you can't narrative your way around math. This is why the experiment's failure matters so much. It didn't end with collapse. It ended with constraint. A world where economic power is less about dominance and more about access. And access, by definition, is unequal. Some countries will secure it early. Some industries will lock it in. Some households will adapt faster than others. Most won't realize what's happening until it's already priced in. And that brings us to the final, uncomfortable question. If this is the direction of travel, if the system has shifted from control to competition, what, if anything, actually works anymore? That's where we go next. That supply responds to price. That technology substitutes scarcity. They'll argue that what you're seeing right now isn't failure, it's transition. Messy, yes. Uncomfortable, yes. But ultimately self-correcting. They'll point to history. Oil shocks in the 1970s eventually stabilized. Globalization absorbed China's rise. Financial crises healed. Living standards recovered. And they're not wrong. Markets do adapt. But here's where that argument quietly breaks down. Adaptation doesn't mean reversal. It means a new baseline. Every major economic transition resets the floor, not the ceiling. After each shock, productivity improves, but costs rarely return to where they were. Housing after 2008 didn't get cheaper long-term. Healthcare never reverted. Education never reset. The system didn't go back. It moved forward, with more friction baked in. This is the distinction that matters. The skeptic assumes this moment is cyclical. The data suggests it's structural, because this isn't just demand overheating, it's constraint hardening. Energy systems that can't scale instantly. Supply chains that traded efficiency for resilience. Currencies that no longer dominate by default. Governments competing for the same finite inputs at the same time. Those aren't conditions that fade with time. They compound. Now let's steelman the strongest counterpoint. What if new supply floods the market? What if innovation solves scarcity? What if growth resumes and absorbs the shock? All possible. But look at the timelines. A copper mine takes a decade. A refinery takes years. Grid upgrades stretch across political cycles. Demographics don't reverse quickly. Innovation helps at the margins. But margins don't set prices when demand is strategic. And that's the final shift most people haven't internalized yet. The world moved from efficiency economics to security economics. When security matters more than cost, price becomes secondary. That's not ideology, that's procurement logic. And procurement logic doesn't optimize for consumers, it optimizes for continuity. This is why the experiment failed in the most subtle way possible. It proved that economic pressure no longer guarantees control, but it also proved that adaptation isn't free. The cost didn't disappear, it spread across countries, across industries, across households. You didn't vote on it, you didn't negotiate it, you didn't design it, but you're paying for it through higher baselines, through volatility that never quite settles, through long-term affordability slipping just out of reach. So what's the solution? There isn't a single one. There's no policy switch that flips this back, no election that resets the system, no headline that fixes the math. But there is clarity, understanding that the old rules don't apply the same way anymore, that global economics is no longer about dominance, it's about access, and that access is becoming more expensive by design. The people who struggle most in transitions like this aren't the poorest. They're the ones planning their lives based on assumptions that no longer hold. Stable prices, predictable costs, linear progress. Those assumptions worked in a low-friction world. This isn't that world anymore. And that's the real takeaway. Not fear, not panic, awareness. Because when you understand the mechanics, the confusion fades. You stop waiting for things to go back to normal. You start recognizing that this is the new normal being negotiated in real time. And once you see that, you stop being blindsided. You adjust expectations. You ask better questions. You plan with eyes open instead of hoping narratives catch up to reality. That's why this matters. Not because the system collapsed, but because it didn't. It bent, it adapted, and it passed the bill downstream to you. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's really happening beneath the headlines, if it helped you understand why costs keep rising even when the story says they shouldn't, then stay with me. Because the next decade won't be shaped by slogans or promises. It will be shaped by materials, constraints, and decisions made long before most people notice. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time.